Woo! Okay. Hi, Gun. Welcome back. Today, we're discussing a very important step when it comes to figurine painting. We're discussing primers. Now, as I see it, there are two main schools of thought when it comes to priming. There are primers for batch painting, and there are primers for underpainting. We'll get to that in a second, but I think it's a important step to start discussing what primers actually are in the first place. So primers are substances that go onto a figure before you put any actual paint onto them, and they prepare the surface for painting. That's why they're called primers. Primers work by going onto the surface and adhering to it much greater with solvents. They can grab onto a smooth surface better than other substances like paints can, and they level the surface out. So if you have a very smooth surface, like how a lot of figures are with their plastics, the primer adheres onto that smooth surface much easier than actual paint does, and it unifies the surface underneath one very consistent type of feeling that the paint can grab onto, a specific tooth. When the paint is going onto a very smooth surface, for example, like a gloss surface, it tends to want to bead away due to the content of water and acrylic paint. So the primer tends to make the paint more capable of taking the paint on. Primers are designed to get your figures ready to be painted so they can actually take the paint. But there are many different schools of logic that you could use when you're priming. You don't just have to paint black because that's what people say you're supposed to. I highly dislike those types of shibboleths where you're supposed to do things in a certain way, because art has no rules. There are guidelines, but there are no rules. So, when it comes to paint that you can buy, you have two venues to buy them from. You got paint from our hobby store, and you have paint from the artist store. I can tell you right now, I actually don't think that there's any difference between the contents therein, other than very small differences like, is it a satin finish? Is it a matte finish? I really don't think there's any difference. I can't tell. There might be some small ones, but generally speaking, the hobby store paints are going to be much more expensive than the art store paints. If you want to spend the money on them, that's your choice, or the opportunity cost. It's a choice to make. The only exception, I would say, is metallic lines, metallic hobby paints. These are designed with the idea of being on a miniature. This means that the pigment is going to be much more finely ground up and have the better coverage that you're going to need for such a small surface. These come with that in mind, and artist line paints do not. So I definitely recommend using hobby paints for metallic lines. So when it comes to primers, I see that there are two main schools of thought when it comes to using them. You have primers that are for convenience, and you have primers that are for underpainting. Painting for convenience is for figures that are all one uniform tone. So, for example, this here ultramarine, right here. This ultramarine has one very consistent color all over its scheme. And that means that you could just take a blue spray paint, spray all over the model, and that would be finished. You would be basically like halfway there with all your figures. That can be a very effective way to get started. Batch painting a horde of zombies, you can just get like some green. Batch painting skeletons, you get an off-white. Very effective way to get things done. And like when you're doing that much painting, it really doesn't come down to each individual model being looked at. It's more of as whoever said this is very disputed, but the quantity has a quality all its own. For painting that many models, 100 Hormagaunts, 100 Guardsmen, 100 Skeletons, you can just get away with not making each individual thing amazing and perfect and just getting a spray down. that will do a very good job, and you'll be saving a lot of time and spending the time on more important things like putting washes down, doing basing, etc. Then there's painting for underpainting. What is an underpainting? Underpainting is a simplistic set of lights that you put onto a painting. This is mostly well known in the value sketch, in which you have a figure that is done purely in values, that is to say lights, before you go in with colors and start fiddling around with it. So in this case, I have this bust that's done in a value sketch. This I did with an airbrush, but the logic can still work pretty well with a rattle can. Granted, you don't have the control of rattle cans like you do with an airbrush, but when you're beginning, you really have you probably don't have one of these, so you're kind of stuck with this. This is why I always recommend an airbrush as a tool for people if they are invested into the hobby. But rattle cans are an effective way to start because it's the only way you can start. When it comes to actually using them, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One, you definitely need a environment that can facilitate priming. You need to be doing this outside. Actually, where is it? Here it is. Okay. So when it comes to priming itself, you're going to want to get yourself a couple of things. For one, if you have the ability to prime outside, and that it's not raining, it's not too cold, and not blazing hot, then you are going to... It's preferable to do it outside because aerosols like this stink immensely. So a garage, doing this on a patio, anything like that is going to be way preferable than doing it indoors. You're going to want a prime box. This is mine. I only pull this out very rarely, but this is what I use to prime with rattle cans with. Technique is also very important. How you prime is almost as important as the actual conditions that you're priming in. Generally speaking, the primer conditions that you want are between 85 to, say, 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything too hot and the primer is going to be drying before you actually get to the surface, and that will leave a very fuzzy look to it. If it's too cold, primer takes ages to dry. It's easy to touch things and leave a big old fingerprint. You don't want that. You want decent conditions. If you live in a humid environment, I'm sorry, but it's probably just don't. Priming in a humid environment is just a horrible experience. If you live in the South or anything, go inside into a garage because it's not a good time. It's a horrible experience. You can use primers with an airbrush. There are substances that you can use. Styrolres makes a decent matte primer. That's why I used to use this before I discovered Molotow One for All Black. This is what I really like nowadays because it's very high stick and it has a nice satin finish, which can be very nice. And it goes both to a good matte when you use matte paints on it, and it goes to a good shine when you use things like metallics. So this is a very good unilateral paint. Anyway, so when it comes to painting with a underpainting, there are a lot of different ways you can think about that. Generally speaking, what people use is the zenithal light, which is light coming from above on a black primed figure. This is an effective way to start thinking about lighting on figures. This is a discussion on later for lighting in general, but the basic consensus is being able to put down a zenithal light and then put colors that are transparent on top of it, and you get something like a slap chop method, which is relatively effective. I think it's a little bit... putting colors on top of a black and white sketch is a easy, if somewhat easy to notice methodology. I think it's a little half-baked. I think you need to do a little bit more thinking before you just start using them. But it's a good place to start out. Anything that has a dark tone to it is a good base to do your underpainting with. This is burgundy, but there are a lot of really good colors you can use. Anything dark and relatively neutral is a decent place to start. We're talking dark browns, dark reds, dark blues. Obviously, dark colors that are slanted towards one hue or another are going to be giving you a different perception, but these can be very interesting. You can do something like a dark purple Nurgle and get a lot of interesting variants that way. Dark browns are also good starting points. Anything that is neutral and gives a dark value is going to be a decent place to do your base tones with. Black is going to give you the most flexibility, but I find that black can be also a little bit hard. It doesn't give any information, so it can be a choice right there. So we're going to go outside and show off some of these and how to do them. So here we are in a very scary area, also known as outside. Right here, you can see I got my box set up with my figures set up as well. And I got myself my primers. And now we can actually start talking about procedure here. So when it comes to actually doing the priming job itself, the thing you want is you want decent conditions. Right now, it's a good spring day, nice and overcast here in Oregon, and this is a pretty good condition. You don't, if you have sunlight, it's also good. You don't want rain, and you don't want it to be super cold. Anything that is below 40 degrees or anything higher than 90, I think, is a bad priming experience. And if it's also humid, bad time too. As for the primer itself, they say that warm primer works best, but in my personal opinion, as long as it's not cold, room temperature primer is perfectly acceptable. But you do, however, want to shake the absolute bejesus out of your cans. If it's old, if it's new, anything at all, shake the absolute Christ out of this thing. That's probably sufficient. If your arm's hurt, then you've probably shook it up enough. So let's actually get to the priming stage now, shall we? So here I have my figure ready to go. And I got my figure ready to go. And you can see I got my surface ready. I got all my primers shooken up and ready to go. So let's actually talk about technique here. When it comes to spraying effectively, you want to have a spray that neither begins nor ends on the figure itself. So you want to start off the model, spray over the model, and then end off the model as well, as shown. Like that. Definitely a good technique to be shaking your primer during the process. And you just rotate it, and then the next side. Distance is also an important contributing factor. You don't want to blast the model really, really close. That will make the paint very, very thick, and it'll make it gloopy and lose detail. Too far away, however, and the paint might actually dry by the time that it gets to the model and make a fuzzy appearance. So you want to go some distance away. There's no real rule to this, but I found that 1 can length is a pretty good metric. Go ahead and hit the other side a little. All right. Then we're just gonna let that off gas, and we'll set up for the next one.
So it's been about 5 minutes now. We still got our figure here, and I can now pick this guy up quite reliably. We have a nice satin finish. Areas that the paint is particularly thick may take a little longer to dry, which is why I have a bit of paint on my fingers from testing this. But it's been about 5 minutes now, and you have a figure that is relatively primed. There is, however, a bit of an issue. As you can see here with this model, it has got nothing on the other side, which means that paint will not adhere very well to this here. This is a problem, so you need to be actually going around holding this model and painting underneath as well, which I will demonstrate right now. For this, however, I definitely recommend rubber gloves, if only to keep your hands from getting paint on them. If you don't want to use rubber glove, I'm fine with that, but maybe this is a worthy investment of your time. Sometimes doing little bursts can be okay if you know what you're doing, but definitely I would start off with just going and spraying over the layers. Alright, this is ready now. I'll put this off to the side. So there's other ways you can do priming than with just one solid color. There's also the underpainting method. For this, we're going to be using a different brand, just as an experimentation, and we're going to be using white primer on top as well. So for that, I have this can of Krylon. This is red oxide, which is a really good color for priming, since it's so neutral. It'll give a nice warm tone to everything. And we're going to use this for this next one. Alright. Now we have this thing done, we're going to go ahead and time how long this takes to get to touch dry. About 40 seconds. That's how long it took. So you can already tell, I can already tell you right now that this took a little longer than this brand of paint, which is fine, but it's something to consider that different brands will give you different results. But that's not what we're done with here. We are going to be doing the zenithal prime on this, so I'm going to go ahead and show you what I'm doing here. So here we have the figure ready to go. I got my white spray paint shaken up, and there is no aerosol at all on this thing. Oh, there we go. So, word to the wise, well, you know something here. White spray paints suck. These things are very chunky. They don't work very well. The only white spray I found is Games Workshop's White Scar. That one's pretty good, but it is also Games Workshop, and they're expensive, and I don't like them too much. Whatever the case is, primer of this nature you should definitely be shaking the absolute Christ out of, and you'll see what I mean by a second. So we got our figure here. It's dead, Jim. All right. So, as you can see here, we now have a figure that has a very simple modulation of light over the shadows. And this means that you can go very easily with a transparent colors and get your thing done. These are really effective methods to paint with, these zenithal sketches. But you'll see in a second what this effect can do.
Okay, we're back now. And I have gone ahead and done the luxury of preparing this figure ahead of time. As you can see, it is painted with white on one half and black on the next. This will be important later, but this is to illustrate that why you'd want to paint certain tones for certain things. So when it comes to painting with light colors, you definitely want to have a light base coat or a light underpainting. This is because light colors have very poor opacity, but they have very high coverage. So if I'm going in with let's say, a very notorious color, yellow, for example, this would be very difficult to do on a black primed model. It just would not cover. But on a white primed model, that would be much more effective. So I'm going to go ahead and show you this now. Okay, so now we have the model present and accounted for. I'm going to use a yellow that most people are familiar with. We're going to use Flash Gets Yellow here. And you'll see very quickly what I mean by all this. This is a... Let's go ahead and get some yellow down on the palette. Okay, so got our yellow down. Now, if we go on the black here of this yellow, you'll notice that while, yes, it is covering somewhat, it is having to really fight against this black to come through. And it looks very green because of that. If I was to do this all over the model, it would take like 3 or 4 coats to get anything, any coverage. So while I can move this around, any kind of opacity, I'm going to have to fight it the whole time. It's a bad show. Bad show there. But if, per chance, I use a light base coat, then the color comes through very brilliant and clear. This goes for any sort of... Actually, it's so bright you can barely even see it due to all this black. But you get the point here. The base tone is a very important contributor towards the effectiveness of your paints. And it can be used to a great advantage. So let's go ahead and take this to the next step further. So here I have the model from before. This is the zenithal primed model. And you can see I have these areas of shadow and I have areas of light. And this is the entire point, is to modulate this from here, because I have something to work off of from. For this, you're going to need colors that have a strong amount of staining power, but don't have much opacity, because you want to keep these dark areas and want to keep these light areas. So for this, it's very effective to use colors that do so. You can use things like ink. Ink is an effective way, but it ends up getting a little glossy. It's something to consider. You can use instant tones. These will work very well. You can use... we'll use this one because I haven't used this in a while. We'll use this one. We'll use Striking Scorpion Green. You can use contrast as well. I like using these for their transparent nature, but there are all sorts of other things that you can use. Chimera tends to make really nice paints for this because they tend to be a little bit on the transparent side, as you can see here of this blue. But I like these contrasts because they facilitate this kind of nature from the word go. And they can be used in airbrush without any kind of preparation. So I'll go ahead and lay those here. Get a new brush. Now, what's going to be interesting here is seeing how this red interacts with this green tone. This is not a color theory video, but you'll see how these colored primers can act very differently from others. That is to say, black would be very neutral, but red is going to give this an interesting look. So let's go ahead and see how this looks here. Okay, so now you can see that I have painted over this with a transparent color. And while some parts are a little bit wet here, you can see how this green has interacted very interestingly with this red and is leaving a lot more of an interesting impact than, say, this here black is. The contrast between red and green makes this a very strong complement, but it's neutral enough that it's not going to be pulling too much attention. Green, it still reads as green. This means that you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck with a colored base than with a black one. Yeah. And here is our final piece for the puzzle here. This is the model that was primed of all one color. This means that I can go ahead and treat this as if finding all the little spots, and I can start just picking out things. So for this, I'm going to just use a dry brush and do something very simple with this and just make something that's simple and easy. So because of all this texture, I'm going to get some, let's see here. Let's go ahead and get a rough, dry color. Let's go with this, Scale 75. This is Kalahari Brown. Or Kalahari Orange, excuse me. And I'm using this specifically because it's very matte. Scale 75 colors are all matte. So we'll go ahead and load our brush. Until I feel like I got enough paint integrated. This is a reasonable starting point for a model here. But you can see how this can be a little bit difficult to work with. When your model is this complex, you have to go in and start pulling out every single little segment and treating it as its own, rather than having a unified whole. This is really why I like this method here, the Zenithal Prime, because it leaves everything a little bit more neutral, and you can work with colors that have a natural tendency to work like you expect them to. At least this is how I see it. You might like the other methods. That's why I've shown you how to do them all here. But I hope that you found something useful out of this little venture into priming, and I hope to give you more information in the future. If you liked this video, please consider liking and subscribing. And if you really have a question, please put things into the comments section. I'd love to answer questions. And I will see you next time. Take care.